For close to 30 years, one man has ruled Belarus. But might the EU move to push Alexander Lukashenko out? The Bloc meets in Austria to look at hopes for democracy in the country. Is this the beginning of the end for Europe's last dictator? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the Belarus conference in Vienna. Well, backed by Russia, he's not afraid of using repressive tactics to stay in power. But is Alexander Lukashenko's reign now at risk? The Belarusian president is accused of orchestrating a crisis at the Poland-Belarus border in an attempt to destabilize the European Union. But while Minsk denies it's done anything wrong, the EU is furious. And several of its leaders have met in Vienna to discuss what can be done. Foreign ministers from Germany and the Baltic states attended the event, and Austrian Chancellor Alexander Schallenberg says it is crucial the EU forms a united response.
From my perspective, one thing is very clear. The EU must not give in to blackmail from Lukashenko. We have to respond united and very clearly to this state-sponsored hybrid attack against the European Union. And we will continue to stand with our friends in Poland, Lithuania and Latvia and react promptly and clearly if needed. And that's why I welcome that the European Union, that the foreign ministers have decided to impose new sanctions against those responsible for this misuse of migration.
Well, in addition to imposing new sanctions, the EU is also calling for dialogue. But Belarusian opposition figure Svetlana Tikhanovskaya argues Lukashenko only understands pressure.
There is no point in discussing anything with Lukashenko. He simply cannot be trusted. He cannot be re-educated. Experience shows that only pressure works. The aim of this pressure should be the dialogue between Belarusians. However, what dialogue can we have if those who must be part of it are still in prison? What dialogue can we have when people are being detained and tortured daily in KGB prisons? The real dialogue will begin only when all political prisoners are released and violence ends. Today, I asked ministers to refrain from any contacts with the regime until these conditions met. It would only strengthen the feeling of impunity.
Representatives from Minsk were invited to attend, but refused. And earlier this month, the Belarusian foreign minister called the summit a waste of time.
The conference, sponsored, as I understand it, by Austria, is an absolutely fruitless and meaningless idea. Moreover, we consider it as an absolutely unfriendly step towards Belarus. No Belarusian officials will take part in it. The event will be held for the sake of appearances. Once again, they will bring together self-exiled opponents of the Belarusian government to discuss the prospects for changing the government in Belarus without having the slightest ability to do so. They talk about some kind of restoration, reconstruction of Belarus, as if Belarus lay in ruins with its economy completely destroyed. The situation looks completely different today. The economy is growing in the face of the sanctions. So is the gross domestic product. I have no doubts that despite future sanctions, our state and society will continue with life as normal.
Well, Alexander Lukashenko has never hidden his disdain for the West, and his relationship with the EU has deteriorated further over the last few years. In August 2020, the controversial president secured a sixth term in office after a contentious election. But the result was rejected by the Bloc, as well as hundreds of thousands of Belarusians. For months, they rallied, calling for the president to resign. He responded with force. Several demonstrators were killed, thousands were detained in a brutal crackdown, and opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was forced to flee to Lithuania. The EU imposed sanctions on Belarus, and French President Emmanuel Macron said it was time for Lukashenko to go.
What's happening in Belarus is a crisis of power, an authoritarian power that can't manage to accept the logic of democracy and is clinging on by force. It's clear that Lukashenko must go.
So what does Europe want for Belarus? Well, to discuss that now, I'm joined by Franak Viacorka, who has been at the conference in Vienna. He's a senior advisor to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. In Berlin, we have Daniel Krutzinna. He was an advisor to a former Belarusian prime minister. And in Brussels is historian and Russian affairs analyst Gilbert Doctorow, who also wrote the recently published Russia in the Turbulent 90s diaries, memoirs, and documents. Thanks all so much for being with us. First, let's get to the conference in Vienna. Gilbert, I'll start with you. Was there any value added here, especially without Belarusian participation?
Well, the chances of value being added were defined by the participants, the key participants. These were foreign ministers of several states. The interesting thing reading the list of participants is that they are not all aligned. On the contrary, you have several of the members from the Baltics who have been hostile to Belarus and who have been influential in promoting the fortunes of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. On the other side, you have several countries which are more understanding of Russia and less volatile, less ready to push relations with Russia to the extreme. I mention Russia rather than Belarus because in my interpretation of what we are witnessing, Belarus is an instrument of NATO, of the EU, and of the United States against Russia. Belarus is not an entity in and of itself that has particular interest to any of these parties in the West. It is part of the overall waging of a new Cold War. It is a second front in addition to the Ukraine, by which the United States and its NATO allies have the ambition of applying a massive pressure to Moscow and of taming its vocal opposition to U.S. global hegemony.
Okay, let me ask Franak if you're on the same page. Is it more about EU states, perhaps forming a united response to a new Cold War against Russia, or is this actually about Belarus and trying to bring democracy to the country?
Honestly, what I heard right now is just craziness. Belarus is an independent, sovereign country. It's not part of Russia. And to discuss Belarus and crisis in Belarus as the part of Russian crisis, it's misleading. It's a huge mistake, and it's dangerous as well. What we saw today, a leader of Belarusian people, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who won elections in 2020 and represented Belarusian people, accompanied by all major political figures in Belarus who are not in prison. She represented interests of Belarusian people. And the number of 15 countries were represented, number of ministers who expressed solidarity and support for Belarusian cause. We have on one side crazy dictator who lost elections, who built military junta around him and trying to stay in power, and we have democratic forces supported, solidarized by international community, looking for the way out of the crisis.
Okay, Gilbert, I will let you respond quickly before I want to get Daniel in. Go ahead.
It's very difficult to have a conversation with somebody who uses ad hominem logic. Calling your debating partners crazy is not a good start to a serious conversation. I'll stop right there.
Okay. Daniel, just let me get your opinion, if you're willing to share that, with what you just heard in the exchange between our two other panelists here. I'm curious.
Well, I think it's very important going back to the events of 2020. It is indeed true that this was not at all about geopolitics, but it was about an election that was most likely lost by the former president, Mr. Lukashenko. He refused to basically step down or recognized that he lost the elections. There were massive protests going on the streets. And as a reaction to these protests, there was a massive intervention from Russia supporting Lukashenko, basically by bringing in more than 100 pro-Russian and journalists that were substituting Belarusian journalists from the government who refused to basically falsify news. There was a massive threat to local elites from the Russian side that basically if they would change sides, they would considered by Russia to be predators and basically paid by the West. So basically I see that what's going on in terms of support to the Belarusian people from the West is more a reaction towards initial Russian support to Lukashenko regime that lost the election. So basically, if Russia would have behaved differently initially, I don't think that we would have this geopolitical thing going on now. Maybe I stop there.
Okay. Daniel, I want to pick up with you on something else, though, because you realized actually early on when it came to applying pressure on Lukashenko, why, for example, a general strike wouldn't work and why the sanctions in place wouldn't be effective because they didn't hit the business elite that was connected to the government and, you know, hold a lot of their money really outside the country. First, let me ask you, I mean, have you seen any progress on the sanctions front? I mean, what exactly would you want to see ideally to make an actual difference on the ground in Minsk?
I don't know. I'm not in the position to advocate any sanctions or so. The only article that
But you
I
know
wrote,
the economy. You know the economy.
Yeah,
you know what would put
yes.
the real pressure on.
What I was basically saying is that the sanctions in the current form, without spreading to third states in the case of Iran, have not shown a high effectiveness, especially because the Belarusian regime is backed up by Russia. What I also said is that many of the sanctions that are currently going on are basically not hitting so much the regime, but they are hitting the ordinary people of Belarus also big time, because there are travel restrictions, because the general financial sanctions are increasing cost of financing for all enterprises in the country. There's a huge outflow of capital from Belarus. And this all is, for at least short term, also hitting very much the people. So the question that I was asking myself, isn't there a possibility to either make the sanctions more targeted or starting a dialogue process that really is engaging all sides? Because it cannot be in the interest of nor the West, nor Russia, nor the people of Belarus, which should really be put first place, that the current situation remains as it is.
Okay. Franak, I want to get your thoughts on that, especially the action that the EU has already taken via sanctions. Have they been effective? Do you think the EU is trying hard enough if they genuinely want to see change at the top in Minsk?
So actually, this was one of the major topics of the conference, how to start a dialogue. But we see that the regime doesn't want a dialogue. Instead, they are hijacking airplane. They are organizing a migrant border crisis by bringing people from Middle East to take revenge in Poland. And definitely, latest interview to BBC of Lukashenko, when he says that he will massacre all his opponents, it's not the sign of readiness for dialogue. In order to force him to have dialogue, pressure must be increased. And the West has not much instruments, and sanctions are the strongest leverage the West actually has. And of course, we want sanctions to be targeted. But a good thing that in Belarus economy, we pretty more or less we know where we should target, because the major sectors that are being sanctioned till today are controlled somehow by Lukashenko or his cronies. And we often hear when sanctions are coming how the people from the regime are trying to contact us. It means they're also worried of sanctions. This is why so far we didn't see the real effect of sanctions, only because they didn't work in full till today.
Franak, let me ask you how badly you believe the EU wants Lukashenko out now? Or do you fear there is a case of better the devil you know in certain European member states?
That's a good question, but I think the most important Belarusians, people to have Lukashenko out. And first of all, Belarusians showed last year they don't see the future with this regime. They don't see authoritarianism in the Belarus of their dreams, but also how persistent and how brave Belarusians will be. It will define how strong the Western and international reaction will be. What we as political leaders have to do, we have to amplify the voice of those underground. And so far, I can say with 100% confidence, there is no apathy, there is no frustration, and there is no readiness of Belarusian society to accept Lukashenko for another presidential term.
Okay, Gilbert, let me ask you if you believe the West actually underestimates genuine support for Lukashenko in Belarus itself?
First, I'd like to break down the West because this is not a monolith. When you speak of the EU, we're really speaking of 3 or 4 countries that are the frontline states by their own wishes. The number 1 frontline state is Poland. The Belarus conflict serves the purposes of leadership in Warsaw perfectly as a wonderful distraction from its own travails with the EU Commission and the EU Parliament over its violation of supremacy of law. So in the case of Poland, it is staging itself, presenting itself in its historic pose as the defender, the shield of Western civilization against the barbarians to the east. Belarus serves this purpose perfectly. All the conflict on the border serves this purpose perfectly. Then again, you have Lithuania, which has been on the forefront of the countries with United States assistance and goading in promoting a new Cold War. And they are the heroes of your pretender Tsarina sitting in their reach. The Tikhanovskaya. The Poles, I've already said, they have an historic interest in the territory of Belarus that goes back 300 years. In the case of Lithuania, the same story. This Middle Europa territory has been a political football between major powers of Turkey, Russia, and Poland for 400 years. So we're witnessing a resumption, a restoration of ambitions and conflicts that have long.
But Gilbert, I was trying to ask you really, I mean, if you have any gauge whatsoever, because you seem to think that there's reason that Lukashenko is still there that needs to be respected somehow. Do you not in any way accept that the rallies, the protests we've been seeing in Belarus are a genuine sign that the majority of Belarusians want change? They want Lukashenko out after 3 decades.
I am not a supporter of the Belarus president. I am simply saying that you have to consider what would replace him. And this has been the great crisis. He, by staying in power as long as he did, he created a vacuum around himself, a desert around himself. So when you speak about a civil society who was supposed to be invited to this conference in Vienna, what civil society? There is the tragedy, but there is no justification for the pretensions of people like Tikhanovskaya, and there's no clear path forward to avoid chaos and the assumption of power by utterly irresponsible personalities who have no genuine democratic backing. To say that she was elected is farcical. She wasn't elected. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it's offensive.
Well, it wasn't that straightforward. I mean, sure, her husband, who was supposed to be running, has been detained.
That's not elected. So either you are or you're not. There's nothing questionable about it.
But there has to be some symbolism, at least, that's got some value there. If you can't actually run as a legitimate candidate if you're going to be jailed.
You want to live in a country that's ruled by symbolism. You want to live in
I'm saying there's a lack of any real alternative because everyone's being thrown into detention.
That is the problem. And I'm not saying that Mr. Lukashenko is the answer, but your other participants in today's debate aren't providing an answer either.
So you're saying, effectively, bad can get a lot worse. Watch yourself.
It can definitely get worse. You can have utter chaos.
Let me ask Franak then. I mean, there's a lot to take in there, Franak. First of all, Poland using Belarus as a tool to distract from its own issues with the EU. He describes an entire geopolitical labyrinth that isn't nearly as straightforward as just Belarusians wanting freedom and democracy in their country. What do you make of that?
I saw the surveys, and I must say that many of those who were on the streets last year and this year and are in prison, many of them have some sort of pro-Russian views. Many of them see deeper integration with Russia. Many of them were pro-European as well. So it's definitely not about geopolitics, and any attempts to drag geopolitics into this crisis, it's misleading again. It's about getting rid of dictator because people are really tired. I'm tired. I went to the first year of the school when Lukashenko came to power. I was 6 years old in 1994, and I really didn't know other politicians in Belarus because all of them were either in prison or forced into exile. And Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is the person who united the majority of people, and they really voted for her, but she doesn't want to be the president. She doesn't want to be a leader. Her only mission is to conduct new elections. And you will see when new elections will be announced, there will be dozens of very smart, professional people who deserve to lead the country. There will not be chaos. There will be true democracy and true choice for people.
Okay, we're down to our last few minutes. Daniel, I want to give you some final words here. I mean, which page are you on, or which side do you lean to? Are you fearing that bad could get worse in Belarus, or does Belarus deserve a chance to prosper more on the lines that its former Soviet neighbors have, and that democracy should be pushed for from the outside in?
I personally have been living full-time in Belarus for 12 years. I'm telling you, it's a country very organized with very smart and many talented people. And I simply think that these people have the right for a proper choice of their leader. And I think that also as the Western world, we should more proactively promote our values. And by the way, I think the same is true for Russia. My personal opinion is that Russia is not an Asian country, but at the long term, it will join the family of democratic countries of the West. Belarus has already taken that choice, but there's one person standing in the way at the moment.
Daniel, quickly, do you think any fears that you've heard expressed of this situation with Belarus in the middle between Russia and the EU and world powers could push toward all-out war? Are those fears unfounded?
I mean, we have seen that the Belarusian people themselves did not choose a war decision, right? They were not getting violent on the streets, but they restricted themselves exclusively to democratic means to express their opinion and their non-consent of the announced results of the elections. So I think we should basically stay with the Belarusian people and say we don't want a scenario where Belarus is drawn into some geopolitical games, or there might be even war, but keep this very simple. The Belarusian people have made their choice, and I don't think that any other country has the right to intervene there. And I also don't think that there's any threat of stability in case a new leader will be elected and go to power. Belarus is a very organized country with a lot of smart people. So why shouldn't that country, non-respect of the geopolitical of their geographical situation, shouldn't be made possible to make their choice?
Okay, still Gilbert, very quickly, you don't believe it can be kept that simple, huh?
No, the Belarus has a certain geography. It has certain neighbors, and it has a strategic importance, both to those pressing the agenda of NATO and in Moscow to the Russians as a buffer between Central Europe and Western Europe and Russia. And the Russians will in no way allow it to be used, as Kiev has been used, as a platform for US and NATO military properties against itself.
Okay.
So that compromises the free choice of the country, like it or not.
Okay. Franak Viacorka, Daniel Krutzinna, Gilbert Doctorow, thank you so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Extremely insightful conversation there. And thanks to our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.